or you may have made a vow before God, and then you didn't keep it. Hopefully, you've made some vows before God and you actually kept them. But all of us, in some way, some form, most likely, have made some sort of promise, some sort of commitment to the Lord and definitely to other people that we have struggled to keep or haven't kept. And this chapter, the last chapter of Leviticus, is about is about them making vows and then being able to redeem what they vowed. But for us, this is going to be about us making vows that we should keep. Now, sometimes when Israelites would make a vow, they would vow something to God. They would want to be able to redeem that. So what God gave the Israelites is a way to redeem whatever they vowed to God from God. And then there's also some explanation of that which you vowed that you could not get back. So what can be vowed to God as we dig into Leviticus 27 would be people such as yourself. You could vow yourself, dedicate yourself to the Lord, or you could dedicate someone else. For example, if you were struggling to have a child or your child was sick, you may vow that child to the Lord. And then once that child was born or healed, you would give that child to live at the temple and serve at the tabernacle. Or you could vow an animal. Now, there are the ceremonial clean animals that you could vow, which would be sacrificed. Or there would be animals that were unceremonial unclean, and that you could vow to them as well that could be used. You could even vow your house to the Lord. And you could vow land or field from your family to the Lord. So let's ask this question before we dive into Leviticus 27. I'm going to ask you this question. When do people tend to make vows? When you look back over your life, when have you decided to make a vow to the Lord? I think there are two particular times that surface real easy for us. The first time is a time of distress or desperation. If you've ever been in a time of desperation, maybe you've had some conversations with the Lord in that time of desperation, and you've tried to negotiate a deal with God. And so you may have said something like, God, I promise if you will do this for me, I promise I will do this for you. If you'll get me into this school, then I promise I will do my best when I get to this school, and I will make straight A's. Or maybe if it was a job situation, you say, God, if you'll get me that job, then what I'll do is I'll make sure I honor you at that job. And it could be a number of things in desperation that you have said to God. There are several places throughout the Old Testament where you see people in these desperate situations, and they decide to make a vow to God in their desperation. Show you a couple of them. One is in 1 Samuel chapter 1. There's a woman named Hannah. She's married to a man, Elkanah, who has Hannah as a wife, but also Peninnah is his wife. And the problem Hannah had is Hannah was barren. She couldn't have any children, but the other wife, Peninnah, could have children. And you can imagine, none of us are polygamists and don't know what that's like. You may have watched, Sister Wives or something on TV. But, almost every time you read of a household with polygamy in the Old Testament, you see rivalry between the women. And so that was true in this case. And Hannah couldn't have kids, and Peninnah would, really rub that in because she had children. And it talks about in 1 Samuel that Hannah would go to the tabernacle, and she would cry her eyes out, and she would pour her soul out to God, saying, God, if you would give me a son. And so she says, God, if you would give me a son, then I promise I would dedicate him to you. And then, lo and behold, God grants her request and gives her a son, who we know as Samuel, which is what 1 Samuel is written about the majority of his life. And so at end of 1 Samuel chapter 1, this is what Hannah says. She said, for this child I prayed, in verse 27, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And so what Hannah did is she recognized, number one, and we all should recognize, everything that we have comes from the Lord. but she's also saying her stewardship over this child is going to be short and very limited, because she promised and vowed, God, if you would give me a son, if you would give me a kid, I will give that kid back to you. And so as soon as Samuel was born and he was old enough to be weaned, she carried him to the tabernacle where Eli, the high priest, would begin raising this young man named Samuel. Then also, so she was in distress, so she prayed and she made a vow to God. If you also turn to Jonah, and I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Jonah. Most of us have heard of it to some degree. But Jonah is an Old Testament prophet that God had told to go preach a message to the Ninevites. And the Ninevites were a city of Assyria that the Israelites did not like. And the Assyrians were very brutal people, and the Ninevites were this great big city. And Israel's feeling toward the Assyrians was hatred. And so God tells Jonah, the prophet to Israel, I want you to go to that city in Nineveh, and I want you to preach a message. And if you read the message, it's actually, when Jonah finally preaches, I think it's like 9 words. It's not a big message, but when he goes to the city, they hear it and they repent. And that is the last thing that Jonah wanted to happen. Jonah wanted them to all perish. He didn't want them to tell what God had said, and he didn't want them to be warned, so he got on a boat and went the opposite direction as far as he could go. But the problem is, you can't ever run from God. Anybody ever try to run from God? And then you find out wherever you run to, he's there. And so God finds him on the boat and then causes a storm to come up. They throw him off the boat, or he jumps off the boat. And then he does it. The story is he gets swallowed by a great fish. The fish swallows him. And, we would say he's in the belly of a whale. We don't know exactly what the fish was, but he's in the belly of this whale. And it's in that moment of desperation. Because if you're in the belly of a giant fish, guess what? That'd be a moment of desperation. That would feel like the end is near. So it's in that moment he'd begin to pray. And he did what we do when we get desperate. God, if you would just do this for me, I will do this for you. And we begin to make a vow to God, and we begin to cry out to God. It's exactly what Jonah did. He got in this situation. In chapter 2, verse 9, at the end of his prayer, this is what he says. But with a voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you. So I'm going to be grateful. I'm going to give you a sacrifice. And what I have vowed, I will pay. Because salvation belongs to you, Lord. In other words, if you get me out of this jam, if you get me out of this gunk in this belly of this fish, then I will pay what I vowed. I'm making a vow to you, and we don't know exactly what he vowed, but it probably was something like this. If you get me out of this great fish, I promise I'll go to Nineveh and I'll preach to them what you told me. Have you been there? You may have been there recently. You thought, hey, if you ever get me out of this jam, God, this is what I'll do. I remember, I don't know if you are old enough to remember or ever seen, there was an old movie that I always think about when it comes to making vows to God and negotiating with God. It was in 1978. And I don't know why I remember parts of this movie, but it was a movie called The End. And it was Burt Reynolds and a guy named Dom DeLuise. And basically the story is Burt Reynolds plays this guy named Sonny, and he's distraught about his life, and so he wants to die. So he hires this guy from the lunatic place, who Dom DeLuise is playing. I don't remember his name. And he is trying to kill himself, and he's trying to get him to help him kill himself. So he could continue throughout the movie to try to commit suicide. But there's one scene where he goes out into this big lake, and he's swam out as far as he's way out, and he's going to drown himself. And when he gets out there, he decides as he goes on the water, well, maybe I want to live. But he's so far out, he's like, I can't make it back. He's exhausted. So he starts swimming back, and he starts negotiating with the Lord. And he's saying to the Lord, Lord, I just need you to give me strength to get back. And if you'll just give me strength, I'll be a better man. I'm going to be a better husband. I'm going to be a better father. I'm going to keep the 10 Commandments. I'm not going to murder anybody. I'm not going to commit adultery. And I'll learn the rest of the 10 Commandments because he didn't know them all. And he's swimming back, and he's just praying the whole time, God, I'll be changed. I'll give you this, and I'll quit ripping off people in my business, until he gets up to the shore, because God had brought him all that way, and then he reneged on his deal. Have you ever reneged on your deal with God? You ever made a vow to God in desperation, and then later think, I don't know if I should have did that. That was a little bit too much. And so we've all been there where we've gone too far with our vows to God, or it feels like we've gone too far. And so that's one time when we make vows to God. So when we read through Leviticus 27, you'll see, why would a person make this kind of a vow to God? Because they may be in a time of desperation. Or another time that we tend to do it is maybe a time of blessing, where we're seeking the Lord to do something to bless us. There's a story in Genesis chapter 20 where a young man named Jacob, chapter 28, named Jacob, makes a vow to God. He's wants to be blessed by God, and he has this incredible dream. He sees angels going back and forth on the ladder up to heaven, and he wakes up and he's like, surely God's here. And so in chapter 28, during this moment, he's in this moment where he's just seeing God at work. And so he says, so early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. But the name of the city was Luz at first. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, and notice here's the vow, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I set up shall be a pillar, and shall be God's house. And all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. This is Jacob saying, God, if you'll go with me on this journey, and if you'll bless me, and you'll get me back to my father's house, and I've been blessed by you, then here's what I'll do. I'll give you a tenth of everything I own. That's what a tithe is. A tithe is a tenth. And so it's one of the first times he's not commanded to do this, but he gives a vow to say, God, if you'll do this for me, then I'll do this for you. If you'll bless me, then this is what I'll do. That's how we operate with God. We try to negotiate deals with God. And so we say, hey, if you'll do this for me, then I will do this for you. Not that God needs us to do anything, but we need him to do things for us, and so we seek to negotiate a deal. So it's in a time that we want to be blessed that we'll ask God to do things for us. Going back to what we talked about earlier. God, I've worked hard, and I've tried to honor you with my life, and there's a promotion at work, and if you'll just give me that promotion so I can get a raise, then I'll be at church every Sunday this year. God, if you'll do this for me. I know in my past, we knew a lady who lived down the street from us. She had trouble having children, so she promised God, because she lost an ovary, and she still had one. She said, God, if you'll give me a kid, I'll have as many kids as I can possibly have. And I think last count was like 12 or 13 before we moved. She couldn't really afford them, but she was struggling because she made a vow to God. And so this is the kind of thing that this passage is about. Now let's talk real quickly before we dive into Leviticus 27. There are some warnings about this kind of way of dealing with God. Solomon writes both of the warnings, and the first warning he gives as a younger man or a middle-aged man in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 25. Let me read to you what he says. He says, it is a snare to say rashly, to use your mouth and say it is holy. In other words, to make a vow. And to reflect only after making vows. In other words, when you make a vow, you actually need to be careful, because you could be setting a trap for yourself. That's that moment when you've made the vow, and then you go, after you made it and God has acted on your behalf, you go, uh-oh, I probably bit off more than I could chew. I wrote a check that I really am not sure I can cash. And Solomon says, hey, this is not how you should go about making vows. You don't reflect on them after you've made them, you reflect on making that vow before you make it. In other words, before I give a commitment to God especially, but to other people, I need to reflect on that to make sure that that's a commitment that I want to make, that a commitment that I'm willing to keep. Because if I'm not willing to keep that vow and I'm not willing to move forward, then I don't need to make that vow. You ever had somebody make a vow to you and then come back and say, hey, yeah, I need out of that commitment. Can I get out of that commitment? And you're struggling with it. Why'd you make the commitment in the first place? And you've probably been on both sides of that. We all have. Reflection should always take place before the commitment, not afterwards. And so Ecclesiastes, a few chapters over, Solomon talks about this as well. And he says, especially those of us who go to worship, and we want to kind of show off in front of everybody and make a commitment in front of everybody. So we need to be careful with that. Here's what he says in that situation. He says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go with caution. To draw near to listen is better than to offer a sacrifice of fools, for they don't know what they're doing. They are doing evil. In other words, don't be going up to the house of worship to talk. Go there to listen. Go there to learn. Don't be a fool. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth, so humble yourself. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much busyness, and a fool's voice with many words. Basically, that's Solomon saying, slow your roll before God. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin, and do not say before a messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase, words grow many, there's vanity, but God is the one you must fear. In other words, he says, when you go before God and you're with God's people, be careful what you vow. Be careful about the commitments you make to God. Don't be negotiating with God. You really need to reflect on what you say. In other words, don't speak hastily. Don't jump into something that you're really not prepared to do or prepared to pay. And so he says, when you approach God, it'd be better if you kept your mouth shut. And it'd be better if you didn't look at other people and say, you know what, I'm going to do this for God. Because if you make that comment, God holds you accountable to that. And so be careful about the vows that you make. Now, if an Israelite did this, there were some rules that God had given the nation of Israel on how they were supposed to handle this. So if you got yourself in a situation and you were desperate and you made a vow to God, how could you get back what you vowed to God? How could you redeem it? And there's a way to redeem it. God had set up a system for the Israelites where they could redeem things that they had committed to God. And so let's take a look at it. So this is chapter 27, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, if anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuation of persons, then the valuation of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old shall be 50 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. If a person is a female, the valuation shall be 30 shekels. If the person is from 5 years old up to 20 years old, the valuation should be for a male 20 shekels and for a female 10 shekels. If the person is from a month old up to 5 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 5 shekels of silver, for the female 3 shekels of silver. And if the person is 60 years old or over, then the valuation for a male shall be 15 shekels, for a female 10 shekels. And if someone is too poor to pay the valuation, then he shall be made to stand before the priest, and the priest value him, and the priest shall value him according to what the vower can afford. Now, going back to verse 1, what we see is this is making a special vow. This is something that's vowed to God that's outside of the normal rules. This is that moment where it could be, instead of special, an extraordinary vow or a difficult vow that would be hard to keep. It's something that would be a sacrifice to God. Some of you wouldn't normally give to God. And so over and beyond what you would normally give. So the first part is if you vowed a person, yourself or someone else. For example, Hannah vowed Samuel to God and left him at the temple when he was just a young baby after he was weaned and left him there. So she wanted to redeem him. She would have to go about the redemption process as living here. So if you vowed someone, the basic way that you would go is you'd have to go pay a certain price of silver for them to be released from that vow. So how this would work is if you were male from birth to 5 years old, it would be 5 shekels of silver. 5 to 20, 20 shekels. 20 to 60 years old, 50 shekels. If you're 60 plus, that's gone down to 15 shekels. Then if you're female, it'd be from birth to 5, 3 shekels. 5 to 20, 10. 20 to 60 years old, 30 shekels. 60 plus, 10 shekels. Now, here's the thing I want to caution you about. What this is about is not about a person's intrinsic value. This is about their labor value. In other words, so don't read into this, well, men are just more valuable than women. That's not what this is about. Sometimes when we read things like this, we're like, how could the Lord do that? Are men more valuable than women? And that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's teaching. If that were true, you would probably not see 60-plus-year-olds getting a lower valuation than the teenagers. What you see is an evaluation based on the labor of the day and the labor that would be around the tabernacle. And so boys and men got a higher valuation based on their physical ability to probably do more than a woman could with her body. And number two is, keeping in mind that a woman, if she was a childbearing age, she would be able to have kids that would put her out of work for a little while. If she was menstruating, she would be unclean for a while, so she wouldn't be able to necessarily be around the tabernacle. And so there were issues like that played. And so the priest, when they would make evaluation based on what God had said, it would be based on their ability to do most likely physical labor. So it's not about their intrinsic value. It's not about God saying, men are better. It's just say men are going to be able to carry, in general, heavier stones than women. And, if that offends you, I'm sorry, but most men are physically stronger than women. There are some women stronger than men. Maybe their valuation changes. I don't know. And so if you were in this situation, God even makes an allowance for poor. So if you're a poor person, you want to redeem somebody back, and you couldn't afford the price, you'd make an appointment with the priest, sit down with the priest and say, I want to get my son back. He's, he's 15 years old, and he's worth 20 shekels of silver. But, we're poor. We're never going to be able to get 20 shekels of silver. So is there an evaluation you could make for us that we could afford? And so would sit down and say, well, this boy's 15 years old, and if you could, maybe get 10 shekels of silver, we would release him from the vow, and he would be able to go home with you. And so, that's how that played out in terms of a person. And so God was not saying if you vowed your son or daughter to the tabernacle that they're there for the rest of their life, that they could be redeemed. And so that's important to understand. Also, as we read on, it gets into the animals. If the vow is an animal, verse 9, that may be offered as an offering to the Lord, all of it that he gives to the Lord is holy. He shall not exchange it or make a substitute for it, good or bad for good. If he does, in fact, substitute one animal for the other, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. And if it is unclean animal, that it may be offered as an offering to the Lord, that he shall stand the animal before the priest, and the priest shall value it as either good or bad. As the priest values it, so shall it be. But if he wishes to redeem it, he shall add a fifth of the valuation. So you would vow an animal, the ceremonial clean animal, so for like a sheep, a ram, or something of that nature, you would give it to God and say, God, if you get me out of this jam, I'm going to give you the best sheep in my flock. So God gives you out of the jam, then you take your sheep and you give it to the priest. Say, I made a vow to God, and here's my offering. And so if you wanted to redeem this, you would go back. But one of the stipulations is if you give a sheep, then you can't exchange it by giving the Lord a pigeon. That don't work. So in other words, you can't say, hey, God, here's my sheep, and then decide, I probably don't want to give him sheep, so I'll give him a pigeon instead. That's not a substitute. You can't exchange it like that. It even goes on to say, because we're always looking for loopholes, we make vows to God, and we're like, oh, man, I really bit off more than I could chew there. Really can't afford that. And so what was happening by the time the prophets came in the book of Malachi, this is addressed, because this is, he says, if you want to redeem it, you can't come and say, hey, I gave this sheep, but I really want to give this sheep because that sheep's really the best I got, so I want to give you this lesser sheep. So Malachi, what you discover is God addresses this in verse 14. He says, cursed be the cheat who has a male in his flock and vows it, and yet sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished. For I am a great king, says the Lord of hosts, and my name will be feared among the nations. In other words, you're not to rob God. If you make a vow, then you keep your vow. You vow to give that choice sheep, then that's what you do. So imagine this is probably how it takes place. Look, and we're all probably guilty of this in some way of cheating God. God, if you get me out of this jam, then this is what I'll do. God, you see the blue lights flashing behind you? If you get me out of this ticket, I'll give whatever money that was going to go to that ticket, I'll give it to you. You've been there. So this guy goes out to his pen. He's looking at his flock. He had vowed, because the police had pulled him over, God, I'm gonna make this right. You got me out of that ticket, so I told you I'd give you my choice. He gets out there, and he sees Charlie. Charlie's his best sheep. And he looks over there, and he sees old Tripod. The three-legged one with one bad eye. Got a runny sore on him. He says, you know what? I think God would be okay because he knows my heart. Tripod not going to live long anyway. And I'll keep Charlie for myself, and I'll give Tripod to God. That's what they were doing in Malachi's day. That's what Malachi said. The Lord said, y'all cheating me. You asked me to help you. I get you out of the jam. And what you do is you get into your pen. Then you want to sacrifice the blind animals, the lame animals, the deaf animals. You want to give me the lesser of the animals, but you vowed that you would give this. And you rob God. And so God's rule is you can't do that and honor me. And then he even adds that sometimes people would vow what we would call a ceremonial unclean animal, which would be, they're not bad animals or worse animals. They're not sinful animals. They're just animals that you wouldn't use for sacrifices. So, if you had a guy who made a vow to God and he said, I'm going to give you my donkey. That's an unclean animal. But the priest could use the donkey. They could find a way to put it in service. Then after a while, you decide, boy, I really need that donkey for my field. So what do? You go to the priest and you say, I really want to redeem my vow. So what you would have to do is you would have to pay the valuation that the priest makes on your animal plus 20%. So you pay the valuation of the animal, then you add 20% to it, and you could redeem your animal back for what you vowed. So that's how you do the animals. Verse 14, this is the house. When a man dedicates his house as a holy gift to the Lord, the priest shall value it as either good or bad. As the priest values it, so it shall stand. And if the donor wishes to redeem his house, he shall add a fifth to the valuation of the price, and it shall be his. So you decide, God, I'll give you my house. The house is yours if you'll get me out of this jam. If you'll do this for me and bless me, I'll give you my house. And so God works. The person offers the house to the priest. Priest comes by and gives an appraisal. That's what the good or bad is. Here's the appraisal for the house. And so then the priests are able to use the house. Then you decide, I want to get my house back. So then you go to the priest, and then you find out what the valuation is, and you pay that, and then you give on top of that, it's 20%. So once again, you pay the price, and then you give 20%. So that way, if you vowed your house, you could get your house back. Then it moves into probably more difficult to understand section of this passage is if you vow land or your field. So let's read this. This starts in verse 16. If a man dedicates to the Lord part of the land that is his possession, the valuation shall be in proportion to its seed. A homer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. If he dedicates his field from the year of Jubilee, the valuation shall stand. If he dedicates his field after the Jubilee, then the priest shall calculate the price according to the years that remain until the year of Jubilee, and a deduction shall be made from the valuation. And if he dedicates the field which it wishes to redeem it, then he shall add a fifth to its valuation. It shall remain his. But if he does not wish to redeem the field, or if he has sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed anymore. But the field, when it is released in the Jubilee, shall be a holy gift to the Lord, like the field that has been devoted. The priest shall be in possession of it. If he dedicates to the land a field that he has bought, which is not part of his possession, then the priest shall calculate the amount of valuation up to the year of Jubilee, and the man shall give the valuation on that day as a holy gift to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return from him whom it's bought, to whom the land belongs as a possession. Every valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. 20 gerahs shall make a shekel. So you can see that's got a lot going on. So just to simplify it, so you could give land, and if you have a field that you wanted to vow to the Lord, you could do this. And so the Israelite would vow the land to the priest. Now the priest didn't have land, so what would most likely be taking place is, so I would give my land to the tabernacle. I would still work the land, but I would give what the land produces in terms of seed and fruit to the priest. It would be theirs. And so the yield would go to the priesthood. And so all of this surrounded the year of Jubilee. And so you would look at it and go, so if you do it in the year of Jubilee, then you get the full, if you want to redeem it, to be the full valuation of it. Outside of the year of Jubilee, then you would reduce or add to it based on the time of the transaction of the vow around Jubilee. And so the valuation is, if you want to redeem your land, then you would redeem your land by paying the valuation plus 20%. 20% is the common tax upon the land. If the land was bought from someone else then that you vowed, so you had leased it, the year of Jubilee, then that land would come back to the original family. So the idea is that this would be the land, and if the land could not be redeemed by the year of the Jubilee, then the priest, the land would be the Lord's. And so simply put, if you offered your land in this case, these are the laws that would oversee that. Then you move into the firstborn animals and a vow of that. So, man, I'm in a desperate situation, God. I'll give you my firstborn of my flock. So this is what happens. Firstborn of animals, which is firstborn, belongs to the Lord. No man may dedicate, whether ox or sheep, it's the Lord's. And if it's an unclean animal, they shall bow it back at the valuation and add a fifth to it. And if it's not redeemed, it shall be sold at the valuation. So this is about firstborn animals. Now you got to remember the very first part of this saying firstborn animals already belong to God, because they are instructed at the Passover in Exodus chapter 13 to take the firstborn males were already to be set aside as holy. So that's already the Lord's. In other words, you can't give back to God what he already owns. It would be like me going over to my neighbor's house and say, hey, I want to borrow your riding lawnmower. So he says, hey, man, you can come out and borrow it. Use it for however you want to, for as long as you like. And so you go over, you borrow it, and about 3 months later, I decide I'm going to give it back to him. And so I give it to him, and I act like I'm giving him a gift. by giving him his lawnmower back. That God says that's not how this works. That's already mine. So you can't give to me what's already mine. So I can't give my neighbor a lawnmower when it's already his. I've just been using it. And so what the law is saying is you have to give the firstborns, and that if you're going to offer them, you got to remember that you have to give him something that's not already his. And so if you give a ritually clean animal to God, then it's going to be sacrificed, so you won't get it back because it'll be used in the offering. But if you give an animal that's ceremonial unclean, then you could redeem that firstborn animal back from God. So you would have to do what? You would have to take the valuation and add 20%. Then you could purchase back the firstborn of these animals. Then it goes into what are called devoted things. Verse 28. But no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that he has, whether man or beast, or of his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No one devoted who is to be devoted for destruction for mankind shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. In other words, there are devoted things, and these things already belong to God. You can't give them to God, and you can't get them back, so they can't be redeemed. So these things are given to God. So what are these things? These are things that are permanently devoted to God that you can't get back, so you can't redeem them. So the first of any item will be devoted to God permanently, or any item that was devoted to the Lord that was set aside for destruction. So what would that look like? Just try to help us to kind of see what that would be. One of the things would be things that Israel went to battle, they won the war, and then you get the spoils of war. So after you get those spoils of war, you can't take those things and then give them to God and then redeem them. These are God's, and so they're permanently God's. This is what happens in Joshua chapter 7. After the Israelites were moving into the promised land, they destroyed Jericho by God's hand. They were coming to battle in the city of Ai. And God had told them that these were devoted things, the spoils of war. They were not to keep for themselves. But there was one guy named Achan who decided he'd just keep, sneak a little in his tent and bury it and hide it. Well, so here's what it says. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, and the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took some devoted things, and the anger of the Lord burned against the people of Israel. So when they went to battle, they lost because this guy had taken for himself what was devoted to God. And so they ended up having to flesh that out because God said, Joshua, the reason you lost the battle is because you got a guy who stole my stuff. And so then Joshua began to kind of weed it down. So he got everybody out. He got down to the tribe and then got to the clan. And he was like, you're the guy. They killed him and his family. Because you don't take the things of the Lord's. This also is seen in 1 Samuel chapter 15 when Samuel tells Saul, when you go to the battle with the Amalekites, you are to utterly destroy them, and you are to take care of them, and you're not to keep any of their stuff. And so the devoted things were to be that you kill all the people and you destroyed all their stuff because they're devoted to God. So you take all the spoils of the war, you'd kill all the animals, and you would burn them. Saul decided, because he was afraid of the people and all the good stuff they were getting, that he wouldn't do that. So he kept the king alive, and he tried to hold on to some of the animals. So when Samuel came up, Samuel's like, what's this I hear? And so what happened was, picking up in 1 Samuel 15, just read it to you, said, and he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. So he did some of this, but he didn't do what he was supposed to do. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best sheep and of the oxen and the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good. So they got rid of all the tripods and they kept all the Charlies. And they wouldn't destroy them. And all that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. In other words, so when Samuel gets there, he hears the animals and he's like, what have you done? And this is what caused Saul to be rejected by God as king, because he didn't follow through what he was told to do. He tried to keep some of the things for himself. Deuteronomy chapter 13, we get into a similar situation with instruction of the Lord for the Israelites concerning dealing with false leaders. And so he says in Deuteronomy 13, verse 13, that certain worthless fellows have gone out among you and have drawn away inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods. They draw them in idolatry, which you have not known. Then you shall inquire and make such a search and ask diligently. And behold, if it be true that such an abomination has been done among you, you shall surely put the inhabitants of the city to the sword, devoting it to destruction, all who are in it, its cattle, with the edge of the sword. You shall gather all the spoil into its midst in the open square, and burn the city and spoil in its spoil with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And it shall be a heap forever, and it shall not be built again. In other words, these people led this city into idolatry, and they are to all die, and these things are devoted to God, so destroy them. In other words, don't get sticky fingers. He even goes on to say, none of the devoted things shall stick to your hand. Don't get sticky fingers. And he says that the Lord may turn from the fierceness of his anger and show mercy and have compassion on you and multiply you as he swore to your fathers. You'll be tempted. Imagine the temptation. You're the Israelites in a whole city. The inhabitants are destroyed because of the idolatry. They are put to death. And there's all this good stuff, all these good-looking animals. That'd be hard to do. And so God says, don't get sticky fingers like Achan and take the stuff and put it in your tent. But honor me and trust me. Put your faith in me. And so these were the things that were devoted to God. And so you couldn't devote these things to God in your vow. All right, so this last portion is about tithing. So let's read it. Every tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. And the tithe of the herds and flocks, and every 10th animal of all that passes under the herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good or bad, neither shall he make a substitute for it. If he does substitute for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy, and it shall not be redeemed. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on the Mount Sinai. And so what you have here is this tenth, tithe, which means tenth. And this is really the first mention of it in the law. You have a mention of tithing in Genesis, where Abraham meets Melchizedek, who is a priest from Salem, which eventually would be Jerusalem. And so he meets him, and he prays for God's blessing, and he gives a tenth of what he has to Melchizedek. So he gives him a tithe. So you see this as a model to follow, but at that point, it's not a rule to follow. But then when you get to Leviticus 27, you begin to learn about the tithe. This is where the idea of tithing really is grounded when we get to the New Testament. We talk about, at church, tithing. And so what you're to tithe is from the land, the seed or the fruit that you have. So you give 10% to the Lord. And the tithe went to help the priest. And essentially in the Old Testament, there were three tithes. There was the tithe, the general tithe, then this, which was 10%. There was a tithe of thanksgiving from Deuteronomy 14, 22 through 26. And then there was another tithe that was a tithe for the poor, so in other words, what were the Israelites supposed to give? Not 10%, not 20%, either however you interpret it, 23.3% or 30% on the third year. And so, in other words, so I give my tithe for Leviticus, the Levitical priest. I give a tithe to show my gratitude toward God, and then I give tithe to help the poor, part of their welfare system. And so there's some debate on when you would give it. So every third year, you were supposed to give this other 10% of what we would call alms to give. And so you could give either in seed or fruit, or you could give by giving every 10th animal. In other words, so if you gave your animal, then every 10th animal would go to the Lord, because that would be a 10th. If you only had 9 animals, you wouldn't give until you got the 10th. And then if you gave seed and you decided, man, I really need some seed for my field, what you would do is you go back and you would pay for whatever a 10th, a tithe would cost, plus what? 20%. So then you would go back and you would pay for that to redeem enough seed to go replant your field. So this is how this would work. And so if you gave an animal, what you would do is you would give this animal, and then let's say you wanted to keep that animal. You couldn't substitute it. You could give 2, but you couldn't just give 1. And so this was how the tithe worked. And so these are the rules for making vows and tithes in Israel. So let's close with this. So the Israelites, simply, if you were to break this down, was to keep their commitments, to keep their word, to keep their vows. Jesus challenged us to do the same thing, not to keep the Levitical law, but to be a person who keeps their commitments. Luke chapter 9, verses 61 and 62, Jesus talks to those who are willing to make a commitment to follow him. And so Jesus says, "Yet another said, I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." And Jesus says to him, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." So if you make a commitment to follow Jesus, he says you need to stick with that commitment. You need to go with that commitment. If you put your hand to the plow and then you start looking back, and the plow starts going that way, it's a sign that you weren't really prepared to make that commitment. In other words, we should not make it easy for people to commit their lives to follow Jesus if they don't take it seriously. There are a lot of times people, they hear the good news and they say, yeah, I want to get on and follow Jesus. But when they start following Jesus, it doesn't take them long to stop following Jesus, because they made a commitment they weren't really into keeping. And so Jesus says, don't do that. If you decide to follow me, then follow me. Make sure you keep that in mind. So be wholehearted in this. I remember this verse particularly came up in my life when I decided to go to seminary. And I got there the first semester and I thought it was terrible. And I wanted to come home. And I remember reading this verse over and over. Anybody who makes a commitment, I believed that God had sent me there, but I was like, I want to go home. I didn't want to be in Dallas, Texas. And I would always think about, am I fit to follow Jesus? Because things have gotten a little rough and I ain't handling it too well. You know, when it costs you something or it becomes inconvenient, it really makes you think about what you committed. And so Jesus says, look, if you make a commitment to follow me, keep it. In other words, we should all be people as followers of Christ who keep our word. If we make a commitment, we should follow through it. If not, if we're not able to keep that commitment, we have to go to the person and redeem it. In our situation, it would be asking for permission to get out of it, or how we could make things right. And Jesus spoke about this also in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37, he talked about oaths. So he says, again, you've heard that it was said to those of old, going back to this, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. You shouldn't make a rash vow, but if you do, you need to pay it in full. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, or for it is by the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. And here's where he breaks it down. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. In other words, Jesus says, don't break the ninth commandment. Don't bear false witness. In other words, you need to do what you say you're going to do. He's referring specifically to the law in Deuteronomy chapter 21, where it's written and where Moses says, is it 21? Or 20? It's 23, 21. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay fulfilling it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. So what's Jesus saying? If you make an oath, if you decide you're going to dedicate yourself for something in your life, you're going to make a commitment to God, keep it. Don't be wishy-washy. Don't be double-minded. Don't speak rashly. Don't trap yourself. But simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's how we as followers of Christ should be. That's how Leviticus 27 applies to us. The words that I vow, the things that I say, should be something that people can count on, that God can count on. I should not be known as a promise breaker. I should be known as a promise keeper. I should be known as a person who keeps my word. Anything less of that is evil. It falls short of the glory of God. We glorify God. We make God look good when we as people keep our words. If I got a business and I give somebody my word, I need to follow through with that word. If we as a church give somebody our word, we would need to follow through with that. Whatever we make a vow to do is best we can, we should follow through with it. The CLC, our Church Leadership Council, asked me to do something. I don't know if most people don't know this, but our team that went to Haiti last summer, all the people who gave money to help us get them back. The insurance company have finally, in this past January, reimbursed us for that expense. So as a church, what we did, we decided that we would reach out to everyone who gave and offer their money back to them, because we weren't to make money off of that situation. And so I personally called probably 85% of the people on that list that we could get in contact with, because I gave my word to the CLC that we would try to contact everyone who gave. And to my knowledge, we tried for a couple months to get in contact either through me calling, an email, or text as best we could, everybody who gave. And we scratched them off once we had those conversations. And it was important for me, and it was a lot of extra work, but it was important for me to walk back into the CLC meeting and say, I did what I said we would do. And that's important for all of us. It's important for us to keep our word. When we keep our word, it makes God look good. And so that's what we wanted to do. And that's what we want to do as a church. We want people in our community to see us and say, you know what, you can count on what the people at Grace Point tell you. And that's how Leviticus applies to us. If you make a commitment to Jesus, keep it. If you make a commitment to anyone else, keep it. That's the point. At the end of Leviticus, I read this from a Jewish writer. I don't know for certain that this happens all the time, but this is what a Jewish writer that I read said about Leviticus. It said any time that they would a Jew would read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, they would get to the end of it. They would shout, in our language, "Be strong." In other words, when Joshua is getting ready to lead the Israelites into the land, God tells Joshua, "Be strong and courageous." When David is on his deathbed and Solomon is going to become the king, he tells him to be strong. It's a Hebrew word that just simply means be strong. And so supposedly from this Jewish writer, whenever you would get through reading one of the books of the Torah, you would shout, be strong. So we're done with Leviticus. Strong. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word, for its life to us. It gives us the strength we need, the wisdom we need to navigate life. And there are plenty of times that we have been promise breakers, but you are a great keeper of promises, and so that gives us hope. And Father, in those times we've fallen short and we have not stayed with our commitments, we know that you're merciful. So Father, help us to live a life that exalts you. Help us to live a life that makes you look good. Help us to be people of our word. And it's in your name we pray.